This is Deborah Atkinson, and you're listening to Flip 50, where I address your top questions and struggles. I share what to eat and how to move and how to think to get the energy and the vitality you want in the second and better half. And don't go away. You're not going to want to miss this. I have with me Dr. Lindsay Berkson. She's one of the mothers of functional medicine, considered a thought leader in hormones and functional medicine. She's been teaching CMES, continuing medical education courses for healthcare professionals like MDs and pharmacists for many decades. Recently in Utah, she gave the first CME accredited class. It passed peer review on how and why to prescribe hormones for breast cancer patients to 150 MDs and pharmacists. She had breast cancer 26 years ago, and she's been on hormone replacement for 20 years. She has an ebook on hormones for breast cancer survivors. She has 21 books out, many on hormones, and is a best-selling author. She was a scholar at an estrogen think tank working with the top scientists that discovered the estrogen receptors and profiling for breast cancer patients. There's a lot of misinformation in docs as well as patients. Don't miss out on protection and youth as you age. Let's get the facts straight from a doc and a scientist who knows them. Dr. Berkson, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this opportunity to get hormones straight out to women because there's so much misinformation out there, even in the medical clinical trenches. So thank you, Deborah, really.
Absolutely. And I hear this regularly. I've heard it at the end of every presentation for fitness professionals about here's how to prescribe hormone balancing exercise. I've heard it at the end of programs and during programs from the ladies who are dealing with it, and they have been told, I can't take hormone replacement because I have breast cancer. So what do I do? So you're blowing that out of the water. It's a myth, and we need to crack down on it. So where do we even begin here?
Well, first of all, I'm not the one that's blowing it out of the water. There is solid science. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview of the science. From the 1980s to 2008, there were 20 studies at very prestigious institutions like the Fred Hutchinson Research Cancer Institute, the MD Anderson Institute, at colleges like the University of Wisconsin Medical School. And they followed women with breast cancer who were given estrogen, and the average time was from 2 to 5 years. And those 20 studies showed that women who had breast cancer that took hormone replacement had less recurrence of that breast cancer compared to women who had breast cancer that did not take hormones. In fact, there was an internist at the Cleveland Clinic, which is a very prestigious institution, named Pauline Batur, who did a meta-analysis of 15 studies. That means you take a look at the lay of the land of 15 studies that fulfill certain criteria. And not only was it clear in these 15 studies that were part of those 20 studies I'm just referring to, that women who had breast cancer on hormone replacement had less recurrence. After 7 years, the women who were on breast cancer only had invasive recurrence at 4.5%, and women who were compared that were not on breast cancer had almost 20% increased invasive recurrence. But the other part of it that other studies have also found, that this internist at the Cleveland Clinic found, was women tend to have less mortality if they're on hormone replacement, and they tend to have less what's called all-cause mortality. They tend to die less from a whole bunch of other things because hormones are foundational, and they protect our heart against heart disease and heart attack and stroke. And they protect our bones against fracture and osteoporosis. And a lot of women, if they get a serious hip fracture when they're older, that's a high risk of mortality. And they protect against dementia, which is now one of the big fears of us all. There was a set of studies called the Cache County Studies out of Utah, where they looked at a representative population, almost 10,000 people who had not had Alzheimer's yet, in their 50s, and followed them into the future. So it was called a prospective study. You start with some healthy people and you follow them into the future and you see who gets Alzheimer's. And the women who had been on hormone replacement for at least 10 years had an almost 50% reduction of getting Alzheimer's disease. So estrogen runs over 400 actions in our body. It's not just about perimenopause and menopause. It is foundational. It protects our mitochondria from damage. It protects our brain from shrinkage and cognitive decline. But in breast cancer patients, there have been 20 studies that showed that it reduced the risk of you getting the disease back or dying from the disease. And there were only two studies, and now recently a third one, that went against that grain. One was the Habit study, one was the Million Women study, and recently a Lancet study. Two of them were from a biostatistician, an Austrian named Valerie Belleri, and her work, according to very heavy hitters in the field, can't be substantiated. And there were a lot of issues with those studies, but those nasty studies made the headlines. The Women's Health Initiative came out in July of 2002, and the older demographic is our fastest growing demographic. So 40 institutions got together and said, let's try and take a look at what makes our older ladies healthier so we won't topple Medicare and we'll keep them living better longer. And within the Women's Health Initiative, which were all these studies looking, how do we caretake our aging ladies in the United States? They did a number of hormone studies because women had been given hormones for decades, but no one had ever done a randomized controlled trial on it. And those studies were stopped prematurely because it looked at first glimpse analysis that women were getting more breast cancer and more stroke. And that's what made headline news. Scary stuff around hormones makes headline news. But that's what women heard, that you get more breast cancer and heart disease if you take hormones. But when Yale statisticians and other very smart statisticians over the next few years started to reassess that data, they found that that first blush wasn't true. And the estrogen-only arm, there was a 38% reduction in breast cancer in women just taking estrogen. It was the synthetic progestins, when women combined their estrogen with that created cancer. And they think it created cancer in women who probably already had it to begin with, but it wasn't found. So it caused growth of a pre-existing cancer. Now, all this is such strong data that estrogen protects your breasts, and so does testosterone, which is a whole nother conversation, that Avram Blooming, who is an oncologist in Southern California, wrote a book putting all this data into a book that was just published called Estrogen Matters: Why Taking Hormones in Menopause Can Improve Women's Well-Being and Lengthen Their Lives Without Raising the Risk of Breast Cancer. And he has been the oncologist who ran a 14-year study on 248 women with breast cancer. He tracked them for 14 years. Every year he published data of what was going on with them, and none of them had an increased risk of recurrence or death from the disease. And he used Premarin, horse's urine, which a lot of us functional docs don't like. So it seems like any estrogen you can get is helpful for you. He's no lightweight. In the 1970s and 80s, most women that got breast cancer, it was a disabling sentence. You got disabling mastectomies. You just looked like you'd been through a wood chopper. It was horrific. He was the first oncologist that shook everybody's shoulders in Southern California and said, hey, if you do a lumpectomy and radiation, you get real similar results versus mastectomy, and you don't make the woman have a horrific life after that. So he single-handedly changed the way women were treated with standard of care, and now he's trying to do that with hormones. And he put all of this data into a book showing that there's a lot of research. In fact, Charles Huggins in I think it was the 1970, won a Nobel Prize where he exposed rats to this chemical that always produces mammary tumors in rats. So breast cancer is called mammary tumors in rats, and it's called DMBA. And he gave them DMBA and they got breast tumors. But if he gave them progesterone or estrogen in high dose, they didn't. So early on, hormones were used to treat breast cancer. He got a Nobel Prize for that. But some people that I think, have more desire to be rich and famous and scare people. These scary headlines have made women terrified of estrogen, that they can't take it. They'll get breast cancer. You mention it to someone, they cover their, not even consciously cover their breasts with their arms. They're so terrified of it. And even the doctors today don't understand that there's a lot more science showing that hormone replacement protects you more, even if you're a high risk woman or had breast cancer, than not. That's kind of a little summation of it, but that's such an important message to get out there. I had breast cancer 26 years ago, and I have been on hormone replacement for 20 years.
Wow. And that's pretty phenomenal. But I think, does it as simply as this come back to, any inflammatory types of headlines are what gets attention? Is that how this kind of basically rumor, when you mention all of the research that supports the fact that actually it doesn't contribute to breast cancer risk or mortality, it decreases it? I mean, what's the reason then that this can happen, this misinformation gets so easily accepted?
That's a great question. So, first of all, scary headlines make news. So, I always forget his name. The guy that wrote the gynecologic and fertility book. He's the professor at the University of Oregon. I'll think of his name in a few minutes. But he was very upset when the Women's Health Initiative came out, because he said, we're going against clinical practice and seeing that women are benefited by hormones with this one study, which was later proven wrong. So when the Women's Health Initiative came out, most American doctors threw out their prescription pad for hormones, and women got terrified of hormones. Most of Europe did not. Most gynecologists in Europe kept, and they don't tend to prescribe the same Premarin and Prempro, which is a combination of horse's estrogen with medroxyprogesterone acetate, a synthetic progestin. Most of the physicians in Europe use more natural hormones like estriol or estradiol, but don't tend to use the compounds that we were using. And they didn't tend to stop as much as we did, but the inflammatory headlines made news. And the women haven't gotten the message about the non-inflammatory headlines and the science. That's why I love to talk about Estrogen Matters by Dr. Avram Blooming. You can read about all of this. He put it all into one book, and I have a book out called Safe Hormones, Smart Women, where I also have a chapter on breast cancer since I had it and I was on hormone replacement. I went through the literature, and both of these books, Safe Hormones, Smart Women, and Estrogen Matters, show you the science. Besides scary headlines making better news stories than not, and louder news stories that women hear and doctors hear, and doctors scared to death to lose their license if a woman sues them. If they put her on hormones and then she gets breast cancer, they're afraid of litigious situations. So the litigious atmosphere in the country is another contributing factor. And also, I think the desire for some scientists to be famous no matter what. So I think we have a number of studies that were poorly done. If you break them down, there were problems with them, like the Million Women study. There were lots of problems. Women didn't have a beginning mammogram. They didn't track what kind of hormones the doctors prescribed. 20% of women dropped out. There were lots of issues, yet that made headlines that study proved that hormones cause breast cancer. Well, people like Avram Blooming pick those studies apart and feel like the information those studies are based on did not prove the headlines that nasty, scary study said. So there's some scientists that love to be famous, and they pull together data. And I don't even know why the Lancet published this recent study in September 2nd, because that too, when big hitters like Avram Blooming in the field read it, they feel like the research that scary hormones equal breast cancer article was based on weren't accurate to support those claims. So there's a lot of science where people will make scary claims because it makes them famous. But if you read and know the literature, the studies they're basing it on might not be accurate. So the regular person doesn't know any of this. which is why it's great to have shows like this and books like Safe Hormones, Smart Women, and Estrogen Matters, because you can read and digest and hang out and read again all this information and make a decision for yourself. If you don't want estrogen, there's studies that are coming out with testosterone, which is very anti-proliferative and protective at the breast, and human studies where women with breast cancer are being given testosterone and something called an aromatase inhibitor so it won't convert to estrogen, and they're having less risk of recurrence and higher quality of life so that they're not going through the severe quality of life issues that a lot of women go through after breast cancer intervention.
Phenomenal. I've got a question right now because I'm just imagining our listeners, and many of them may actually, excuse me. Wow. But many of them may actually be, having gone through breast cancer and be under the care of a physician who has advised not to do replacement therapy. But, they're listening to this. They may have come across some ideas about this in the past, and it's finally, settling in, and maybe they want to reconsider for the other reasons we've mentioned, the mitochondria benefits, the bone benefits, just the more proactively aging benefits. What would you say to a woman who's kind of feeling caught between, well, my caregiver's advice is this? What would you suggest that she do?
That is such a great question because we are really perplexed with standard of care. The standard of care is not to give hormones to a woman who has breast cancer. Now, ACOG and NAMS, North American Menopause Society, a few years ago came out saying if you haven't had breast cancer for 20 years, you can go on hormones, you're fine. And NAMS even said you can do vaginal estrogen right after you have breast cancer for painful intercourse and dry vagina or vaginal atrophy. So things are changing a little bit, but the standard of care still, most doctors are afraid to give hormones to a woman who has breast cancer, thinking that it will reawaken the breast cancer cells. But when bilateral removal of the ovaries has not proved to increase survival in women with breast cancer, and if it's true that hormones make you more at risk of breast cancer, then women who are pregnant, which is the highest hormonal time of our life, should have a lot more breast cancer risk if they've had more pregnancies, when exactly the opposite is true. The NIH, the National Cancer Institute, has shown that if women have a pregnancy by the age of 20, they have 1/3 the risk of breast cancer. And there's almost no case ever of a woman being pregnant before the 18 years old of ever having breast cancer. And nuns who never get pregnant have a much higher rate of breast cancer. So the standard of care doesn't match the science. It does not match the science, and women are missing out. And what do you do? Because when you go to your doc, he's afraid of being sued and he's afraid of not doing standard of care. That's a very big issue. When I decided to do hormones, everybody told me I was crazy. Even the functional docs, this is 20 years ago, because I waited 5 years out because I thought that's what I should do before I went on hormone replacement. Knowing what I know now, I wouldn't wait 5 years out. But at that time, that's what I knew. And everybody told me I was crazy. And yet when I go back to my breast cancer doctor to be palpated and have her go over my imaging, she always says, you're the best looking breast cancer patient I have. Hands down, you have to go off hormones. But she's a surgeon and she doesn't know. And I've known her now over so many years and she's aging incredibly. And I'm not aging at that same rate because I'm on hormones. So how does a woman who is a high risk or breast cancer survivor find a physician that will work with her that knows this data? Either you have to give them Estrogen Matters and my book, Safe Hormones, and I have a little ebook on my website called, which I summarize the testosterone studies, and it's only $10, I think. Hand them this information and say, will you work with me? I'll sign a disclaimer. Can we take a dive here and look at giving me hormones? To educate, I have had at least 6 or 7 oncologists call me up when patients have printed out the ebook and handed it to the cancer doc. They've called me or emailed me and said, thank you for putting this together. I'm going to be open-minded to this now because the science is strong. So you either find a doc that you could work with and educate them if they're open to it, or you have to find some of the few doctors that know this data so they're very comfortable with it. My colleague, Dr. David Brownstein in Michigan, for many years now has been giving progesterone and testosterone. And now he's adding estrogen to the mix of breast cancer patients because he knows the science. But he's a very brave and roguelike character that believes in functional medicine and the foundational power of hormones. And that's not that easy to find. I was working for 6 or 7 years here in Austin, Texas, at the Wiseman Family Practice. And we had a young woman in her 30s. Her mother had breast cancer, her sister had breast cancer, and her aunt had breast cancer. And she got talked into doing a prophylactic total hysterectomy based on being a high-risk woman, which is, in my book, not the way to go, but she got talked into it, and she went into early dementia. She couldn't work. She had to put little Post-its on her mirror saying, brush your teeth, take a shower. And she brought in her husband. She's in her 30s. She looked like his grandmother. And she begged us for hormones. And the clinic wrote her prescriptions for hormones. Her brain turned back on. She became normal. She could have a job. And then the owner of the clinic got very uncomfortable with the litigious potential of giving this girl hormones, and he withdrew, and no one else in town would give her hormone replacement because of her history. And she went back into a state of dementia in her 30s. This is a travesty, a travesty. So you have to find, as a patient, somebody that's willing to read the science, and the science is now available in 3 books summarized. They summarize lots and lots and lots of articles. Or you have to find somebody who already understands the science and is working that way, which is a small growing group of docs. I just gave this talk in Utah to 150 doctors and physicians, and the CME committee okayed this talk based on the science it was based on. They're going to ripple out now. So now there's going to be over 50, let's say even half those docs or a third of those docs are going to try it. They're going to start being open to prescribe for women who are high risk or breast cancer survivors. So I'm hoping to pass this information forward, but there is a little bit of a tough ride for you to find the doctor to work with. And you just have to accept that as we're growing in this understanding.
Great answer. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm interested in, Will, and I haven't asked you the question of the day, which is always something very interesting for our listeners, but it's so very relevant here. And we will definitely put your picture in the show notes. But Lindsay, how old are you? Will you share that, please?
As long as you don't tell anyone on any of the dating apps, because I lie on the dating apps, because no one will go out with me if I tell my age on the dating apps.
Nobody would believe it, right?
Well, it's funny. So I've been in functional medicine for almost 49 years. I've had breast cancer 26 years ago. I was a DES daughter, and 75 to 85% of DES daughters got breast cancer within a 2-year window. So it was due to in utero exposure to a very powerful endocrine disrupting compound given as a prenatal vitamin to millions of women from 1938 to 1971. So I've been around for a really long time. And when I now lecture at continuing medical education courses for physicians and pharmacists, no matter what great information I'm giving out, the most powerful take home they get is that I've been through all this. I've been around so long. I'm going to be 71 in December, a month and a half away. And when they hear that, they all jump up. I get a standing ovation. At the break, I'm surrounded by all of these young docs with their phones out. What do you eat? What hormones do you take? How do you live? Because I want to look like you when I'm that old. And I could not be who I am today without hormone replacement. It wouldn't happen. And because of all the cancers and the ill health I had earlier on in life, until I knew I was a DES daughter and could reverse that, I've lost 7.5 organs. And I was very ill with multiple cancers. And now on balanced hormones and the lifestyle that I know is balancing and appropriate for me, I have the youth in my older age that I was never able to enjoy in my younger age. And I can kick A now. And I'm so grateful. And most people do not think of this of 70 years in the 7th decade. They think of you being more frail, not talking with such facile facility, et cetera. And I just love that I could help give hope based on science to people and have opportunities like speaking to your tribe.
I love it. And, and that's so funny that you were saying that, not in the way you're speaking, but this is a crime today that this is only an audio show and not a video show. But your voice, I mean, and I don't just mean the speed and the rate of which you're talking, but you have a youthful voice. Nobody would buy that you're 71. And yet, and I say that, and I want to catch myself almost, because my hope is that we will one day find there's a day when we're not saying that our expectations about 71 are, what you're portraying. That should not be the anomaly. It should be the norm. And hopefully that's the way we're going.
Well, you have estrogen receptors all over your vocal cords. So when you take hormone replacement, you keep the volume of your brain in your hippocampus. Your hippocampus is where your memories live. Mm-hmm. You keep the volume of your skin so you don't have collagen loss like you do with inevitable aging. You keep your voice as a younger voice with more power and projection because you have the hormones that support the mitochondria as well as the tissue integrity. Hormones, aging is basically a loss of hormones. That is what aging is. It is basically a loss of hormones and then a shrinkage and dysregulation of genes and function, because hormones help keep all of that acting more healthfully. So there's no totally avoiding menopause and getting older and getting more frail, but you can push morbidity or getting worse later on in life into a smaller, compressed portion of life so that you actually can achieve being younger longer. And hormones are part of the holy grail of that. They're not just about getting rid of hot flashes. They are not just about having a more lubed vaginal vault and less pain when you make love with your husband. They are literally the anti-aging tool available to us, and they won't prevent dying. They're not going to completely stop aging, but they slow it down, and they protect against heart disease, the number one killer of women, not breast cancer. They protect against colorectal cancer, one of the other big killers. They protect against bone fractures. They keep your whole gut healthier so that you don't have so many gut issues as you age, like microscopic colitis. It's really a major life protector, and we have vilified estrogen. We vilified it, and doctors aren't taught this in med school. So it's very difficult for women who we normally go to a gynecologist or an endocrinologist to talk about hormones. They're not in on this dialogue. So thank you for allowing me to be here to let women know that there are ways to slow down aging. It's not, so this is one thing. It's exercise, as you're the diva of exercise, and great diet are wonderful, but they're not as powerful as balanced hormones. And not just balanced, but taking hormones when you're older. When I used to work at the Wiseman Clinic, the older Wiseman, Richard Wiseman, we'd meet at the water fountain, and he'd say to me this famous little talk: if you took 100 people and put them in a room, and everybody got the memo to exercise and eat well, but half of the women and men were on hormone replacement, you could completely cherry pick them out who was on hormones and who wasn't, because they'd stand up taller, their skin would be shinier, their hair would look better, they would speak with a younger voice and more projection. They stay younger longer. So don't let the fear of hormones, which is inaccurate, make you avoid the best anti-aging tool ever that should be combined with the other lifestyle and exercise tools. And then you have a better chance at living younger longer.
Amen. Okay, preach it, sister. All right, now for listeners, I want to clarify something, because you kind of hit on part of it, and then I'm always asked this, and it kind of comes out of the blue to me, and feels like, oh, wait a minute, where did that come from? But often listeners will say, well, do you do hormone replacement, or you don't believe in that, right? And that's not at all my stance here at Flipping 50. I think it's every woman's decision. And, you do as much. I'm a big believer. You do as much as you can with the other lifestyle habits. We do as much as we can with the hormone balancing exercise prescription.
Love
we,
it.
we try not to drive ourselves in the opposite direction. We want to be on the same route, on the same bus, going the same direction with all the things we're doing. Likewise with the nutrition and the sleep and the way we deal with our stressors and the rest and recovery between exercise, all of that. And then if you also need to get balanced using hormone replacement, then, more power to you. If you are listening and you choose not to, that's your choice. So there's no judgment here, whichever way you go. It's just these are all your options. These are all available to you.
That's
And
a great way to put it.
yeah,
Women, we all get to choose
yeah,
which way we want to go. But a lot of women will say, I'm going to go through menopause naturally, like it's a mantle of honor. Like I'm doing it naturally. If God meant for me to have more hormones, then he would have given me hormones. Well, we wear glasses, we have air conditioning in our home. If we have diabetes, we take insulin. There's lots of ways you can live better through chemistry. So, I myself am missing a lot of hormones and I can't make my own hormones. There's nothing for me to balance out. But it's important for women to know that it's not the scary bugaboo. And in actuality, it's a combining tool. It's not just balancing your hormones, but it's giving you hormones that you normally don't have as you get older. So if you, in my opinion, add it to your incredible hormone balancing exercises and your diet, you get the best possible scenario to age more gently. That just, anyway, it's so interesting. My girlfriends that have chosen to be on hormones versus the ones that say, it's just not for me. When you hit your 60s and 70s, you can see a very huge difference in people. And I'm hoping most of us are going to live to be centenarians now, to be 100. And I would want for us to have very high quality of lives like some pockets in the blue zone on the world have. And I think that this is the winning recipe for that. So it's great to just give people more choices and then they get to decide for themselves.
love it. Totally agree. And okay, so I want to ask you this. So is there a time in your life that you see this now, or what criteria would you use? Is there a time you'll go off?
I will never go off hormones. I will be on hormones up until the time I'm going to go into the grave or into the crematorium. I will never go off hormones. And anyone who has had this experience of you dry up, you age, you cannot believe how age starts to accelerate in the sixth decade. It's quite extraordinary. In the middle of the sixth decade is when it really hits this brick wall. People on hormones, really well balanced, individualized hormones, they do not go through that same shriveling up and aging factor that women who are not on hormones or men. Men go through a slower andropause or a menopause, as we like to call it. But so people that have had doctors and patients who've had this experience say, I'm not going off hormones. There's no way I'm going to be in an estrogen window for just 10 years. And that is what the North American Menopause Society recommends, is the lowest amount for the shortest period of time to get rid of noxious symptoms. And that's not how we in functional medicine see it. We see it as an anti-aging holy grail tool. So I hope I get to stay on hormones forever because I think that's going to keep me, allowing me to have a really active career. My career is hitting it better than it's ever hit in my whole life. I'm going all around the world lecturing and sharing data, and as I teach physicians and I affect patients. And you have to really have dynamic energy to ride all those airplanes and put together all those slides and stand up for 7 to 9 hours in front of all these people and answer questions. And I love it. And being on hormones makes me feel like I can continue to do that. So hopefully I will never have to go off of them. But there's a battle now trying to make bioidentical hormones not available, and it's all a battle around the dollar. It comes down a lot to dollars, and women tend to dollars and litigious scenario, and then ego of scientists, and it's hard for the regular person to know what the truth is. But we do have a battle coming up, and I try and educate my listeners to help us keep our rights to hormones. So those of us who want them, there's about 5 million women in the United States right now on hormones. There used to be 40 million women. So there's a lot less women on hormones. And all those women are going to age worse and topple Medicare and have horrific scenarios with their families as they have dementia and so forth, which a lot of that could be offset if we were on hormones. Half of the women on hormones are on bioidentical and half are on synthetic. And I just hope we get to have the right to choose. And so if you go to my website, drlindsayberkson.com, or you hear of the battle, I hope you decide to help us out so that whoever wants to have them can continue to have them, because they are a very powerful anti-aging tool to be mixed with your exercises and diet, etc.
Awesome. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. So that was my next question. Where can listeners get more of you? You want to spell that out for me? Is it doctor as in DR? Or
it's DR, DR. So the short version of doctor, DRLINDSEYBERKSON.com. And I have a blog that you can read, and I have a free membership that you can sign up for and get my really cool flaxseed muffin recipe that took me about a year to make with my macadamia nut, which is a very anti-inflammatory nut, frosting, and that helps balance your hormones. And I even have a muffin recipe for those women newly diagnosed with breast cancer to help shrink the tumor before they go in for surgery, etc. And you get that for free if you sign up at drlindsayberkson.com. And I have a radio show, Dr. Berkson's Best Health Radio, that you can access through my website or go to iTunes or Google Play or Spotify, etc.
So good. And I just happen to know that that podcast is pretty awesome. So that's a whole nother meaning to muffin top over there, right? Okay, we got it. Dr. Berkson, thanks so much for being here. Love having you. I'm sure we'll have you back by popular demand. Listeners, if you have a question that we missed, I'm sure we stirred up a few things here. Leave it below the show link at flipping50.com/hormones. I love hearing from you. And if this episode was helpful, please leave a rating in iTunes and then share it with a friend. Surround yourself with a supportive community of women on the same journey. To get the most from this week's episode again and how to connect with Dr. Berkson, check out today's show notes at itsflipping50.com/hormones, where you're going to find the juicy downloads, how to get the downloads, and the muffin recipe from Dr. Berkson, and all the resources we mentioned. We mentioned a couple books, and I will put those in there as well. Let's start flipping 50 together.